Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Quarantine History. This video will be dealing with the domestic side of Richard Nixon's presidency. Probably one of the more famous presidencies in U.S. history, mainly because of the Watergate Scandal, which leads to the first and only resignation of an American president. Before we get into that, we will deal with a couple other things, and Watergate will be the last thing that we talk about. So, as you can see, 18-1 is titled Nixon and the Watergate Scandal. Now, Richard Nixon was one of the more accomplished people to be president of the United States. He was a member of the House in the mid-40s. He was then elected to the Senate, became a very popular individual in the early 50s with his connection to the McCarthy tactics. That's basically how he got on the ticket for to be Eisenhower's vice president, is because Eisenhower believed he needed to get those people who were Joe McCarthy fans to vote for him. And so what he did is, instead of obviously making McCarthy his vice president, he went with one of his supporters, and that was Richard Nixon. So he was vice president for 8 years. And then the tides turn for Nixon. He loses the 1960 election to Kennedy. He loses the 1962 governor election in California. And he was basically out of politics for a number of years. And it wasn't until the turmoil of 1968 that he makes his comeback. We know that he wins in 1968 against Hubert Humphrey. He was the third string candidate for the Democrats that year, but nevertheless, he does win. Nixon will actually bring about three of the more notable federal agencies in recent history, the first being OSHA. OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Basically, they're the group that requires safety on job sites, hard hats in construction zones, wet floor signs, when you're at the grocery store, things like that. The DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Agency. Richard Nixon was very against marijuana, and the United States will continue its anti-drug crusade here under Nixon, but the DEA will be created during his time, along with the EPA. The EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and Nixon will create that group to basically look at things like the safety of our water, the safety of our air, safety of the soil. There will be some incidents that caused Americans to say, hey, we need to do something about our environment. When Nixon takes over in early 1969, the economy is starting to go into a tailspin. Richard Nixon will be hit with an economy that is known as stagflation, because he has both recession and inflation at the same time, meaning people are losing jobs and prices are going up at the same time. Usually you see one of the two happening. You either see recession or inflation. You don't see them happening at the same time. Here they were. And economists coined a new term called stagflation. Now, why did this happen? There was three major reasons why. One was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was taking up a lot of federal money. So instead of putting it to things like healthcare, or Head Start, or rebuilding roads or whatever, it went to the Vietnam War. Foreign competition, like I talked about in the other video, places like West Germany and Japan are now economic rivals of the United States, so places have other options when they're buying goods. It's no longer just America, which it had been since the end of World War II. And finally, the increase in oil, the price of oil. America is, hooked on oil. It's not like in Europe, where, in Europe, there's public transportation basically everywhere. In America, it's really only your major cities that have public transportation. Obviously in Uxbridge there isn't public transportation. There's no town bus. There's no taxis. There's no subways. There's none of that. You go to Worcester, you see taxis and you see buses. You go into Boston, obviously you have the subway stations. You have the T. You go into New York City, you have that stuff. You go into Chicago, L.A. Your big cities. But outside of your big cities, if you don't have a license, it's hard to get anywhere. And so people need cars. And because of cars, obviously there's oil. People live in the suburbs. I bet most of your parents, we obviously live in Uxbridge, but they probably work in Worcester or Boston or Framingham or Providence. And obviously you have to drive to work. That means we need oil. And so because of that, the United States during this time was very dependent on this group. This group is called OPEC. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These countries are in the Middle East, and they produce a large portion of the world's oil. And because of that, the United States needs to have, somewhat good relations with some of these countries. This is one of the reasons the United States is usually involved in Middle East issues. We fought 2 wars in the Middle East. We're still there. We have great ties with Israel. And a lot of this deals with oil. But in 1973, these countries called OPEC put an embargo on anyone who was friends with Israel. And because we are, obviously very good friends with Israel, we were hit by this. That meant we weren't getting as much oil on a daily basis. When you don't have enough and the demand is still there, prices go up, and you're eventually going to run out. And that's what was happening. Gas stations didn't have enough. Gas prices will, skyrocket. It would go. Basically, it was 5 times what it usually was. So just to put that in perspective, in 1974, it went from 30 cents a gallon to $1.20 a gallon. To us, that doesn't seem too bad. Right now, gas is about $2. But let's put that in perspective. Let's say something like that happened right now. Let's say gas is $2 a gallon. Multiply that by 5, you're at $10 a gallon. So that's a little different. Trying to get gas for $10 a gallon than 2. So it strained the American economy in the mid-70s. Nixon will try a few things, but nothing worked. Nothing was working, and so the United States is going to have to start producing more oil, which we eventually do. Now, some other domestic issues. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a domestic situation going on called busing. And in busing, what was happening was cities, most of your major cities, they weren't integrating. They weren't doing what Brown v. Board had said, in 1954. And so the federal government basically said, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it for you. And what they would do is, because most of your major cities had neighborhoods, defined by ethnic groups, they would take kids from a white neighborhood, not all of them, some of them, and send them to a non-white neighborhood. Could be black, could be Hispanic, could be Asian, whatever. And vice versa. So you had this mixing of the races for the first time in some of these major cities, and it didn't work. You have a lot of race riots, kids fighting at school on racial lines. And this will go on for a long time. And, obviously some people were for it, others were against it because, their opinion is you can't force social things on people. The government's job isn't to do that. Others would say, no, the government needs to protect the rights of everyone. On the flip side, Richard Nixon was in favor of affirmative action. We've talked about affirmative action, how affirmative action was basically giving jobs and spots in post-education to minorities simply because they are minorities. So on one side he's against busing, but on another he is in favor of affirmative action. Now, the 1972 election, Richard Nixon is up for re-election. He wins easily, mainly because right before the election happens, the United States announces that they have basically the treaty to end the Vietnam War in hand. So because of that, Nixon wins easily. You can see he wins every state, but basically loses one, Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Now, something happened during the election, and it will go on for 2 years. That is known as the Watergate Scandal. About 5 months before the election, in June of 1972, 5 individuals were arrested in Washington, D.C. They were arrested in something called the Watergate Hotel. And in the hotel, there were some business offices. And one of the offices was the headquarters for the Democratic National Committee. So the national group of the Democratic Party. There's Democrat parties in towns, there's Democratic parties in states, and obviously there's the national version. Well, this headquarters was the national headquarters. And 5 people were arrested trying to break into the headquarters of the National Committee. Well, the next day when they go to see a judge, 2 of the men claim that they work for the government. One said, I used to work for the CIA. And the others said, you know what, I was told to come here by the White House. A lot of people didn't believe it at the time, and this will go on for over 2 years. Members of the media got involved. They were trying to figure out, well, why are these 5 men breaking into the Democratic headquarters, 5 months before the election? 2 of the more famous reporters were Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they worked for the Washington Post. And Bernstein actually had an informant. The informant was actually someone high up in the FBI, but no one knew that except for him. And so they used information from the informant. He was given the code name Deep Throat. And Deep Throat basically told the 2 journalists to follow the money. That's because one of the burglars who was arrested at the headquarters had a check on him in his wallet. The check was from the committee to re-elect the president. Why would a burglar have a check for, I think it was $25,000 from the committee to re-elect President Nixon? Here you can watch a video on this part of Watergate. So this will go on, like I said, for 2 years. About a year into the investigation, which eventually becomes known as Watergate, Nixon makes his famous statement, which a lot of people are familiar with, where he basically says, I am not a crook. And this comes back to haunt him because, he was basically guilty of what he said he wasn't doing. While this is going on, the vice president also has problems. The vice president was a man named Spiro Agnew. And Spiro Agnew didn't pay his taxes. And that is a crime in the United States of America. Spiro Agnew was forced to resign because of tax fraud. So while Nixon has his own problems, the vice president is forced to resign. Richard Nixon names Gerald Ford, who was quickly nominated and confirmed as his vice president by Congress. During investigations of the Watergate break-in, it came to be known that Richard Nixon had a secret taping system in the White House, in the Oval Office. He wasn't the first president to do it. It actually goes back to Kennedy. Kennedy, instead of writing things down, would simply hit a button and it would go, he would talk into a recorder and the tapes would then go to his secretary who would write them up. Johnson kept it, Nixon kept it as well. But what Nixon would do is when you came into the Oval Office to have a meeting, he would turn the tape on, and if you promised to do something for him and you didn't do it, he would then basically bring up the tape and say, well, remember when you said you would do this? You haven't done it yet. So it came to light that there was this taping system in the office, and Congress wanted it. The president said, no, I'm not giving it to you. And Congress sued. They sued the President of the United States. So you have the government suing the President. In what became known as Nixon v. U.S., the Supreme Court ruled in the summer of 1974 that Richard Nixon had to turn over the tapes. He tried to claim executive privilege, meaning the President has the right to keep some things secret, especially for national security, and the Supreme Court ruled against him. During this time, Congress started impeachment trials. They don't formally impeach Richard Nixon because he knew he was going to get impeached. And so on August 8th, 1974, about 2 weeks after he was forced to give over the tapes to Congress, he resigns. He is the first and only president to do so. Gerald Ford becomes president. Gerald Ford is the first and only president to never win an election of either vice president or president. And that's going to hurt him in the election of 1976. Watergate is a fascinating event. Every other scandal, is compared to Watergate. Obviously, with what's happening with our current president, obviously Trump. Trump ends up getting impeached because of the Ukraine stuff. So he met a different fate than Nixon. Nixon doesn't get impeached, but resigns. Trump gets impeached, but not removed from office. So, different outcomes here. Also, most scandals are now given the name something gate. Obviously, if you go back to the Patriots, you have Spygate, Deflategate. Everything is now given that name, and it all goes back to Watergate. There's a video here. Make sure you watch that. I wish I could, do more with this, but obviously I can't. So that's it for now. Until next time, be good.